Zhou Tao was a man who had always been good at solving problems. Electrical problems, to be precise. As a senior electrical engineer at the National Grid facility, he was the go-to guy when anything in the system went wrong. If there was an outage, a malfunction, or a potential disaster on the horizon, Zhou was the one the company called in to fix it. His reputation was built on his calm under pressure and his meticulous attention to detail. In a world where power was everything, Zhou knew the grid better than anyone. That morning, however, the issue wasn't something as simple as a broken transformer or a short circuit. It was far worse. The power plant where Zhou was working had just experienced a catastrophic failure, an explosion of sorts, triggered by a rare electrical surge. It wasn't the first failure of its kind, but it was the worst, knocking out power to millions of homes across the nation. Emergency response teams had already been dispatched, and Zhou was called in to troubleshoot. He grabbed his coffee thermos from his desk as he headed out to the disaster site. It was only a 15-minute drive from the facility, but Zhou knew it would be anything but quick and easy. A mass electrical failure like this was the kind of thing that could take down entire sectors of the economy and spark riots. He'd seen it happen before. On the way there, Zhou's mind drifted back to that one thing he had never quite gotten used to, the failure of technology. His career was based on the belief that things could be fixed. After all, electricity was the most powerful force in the world, right? With the right knowledge, you could bend it, shape it, make it do your bidding. The irony of his job, however, was that the more he tried to understand electricity, the more he realized that, at its core, it was an unpredictable force, a beast that could never be tamed. But Zhou never let that stop him. He had always found a way to solve the problem, to make the current flow as it should. As he arrived at the plant, the air buzzed with a sense of urgency. Emergency crews were setting up temporary generators to provide power to vital services, and workers in hard hats scrambled to assess the damage. Zhou walked past them, nodding his greetings, before heading straight to the control room. He had a feeling this wasn't going to be as simple as rerouting power from a nearby substation. Inside the control room, Zhou was immediately greeted by chaos. Engineers were shouting over one another, their voices a jumble of technical jargon. The screens flickered erratically, each one showing a different grid failure. The main power lines were offline, and backup generators were only half operational. The entire system was on the brink of collapse. "Zhou, thank God you're here," said a familiar voice. It was Luo Yifan, a senior government official who had been involved in energy policy for years. "We need your expertise. This could get worse if we don't fix it now." Zhou nodded and got to work, immediately diving into the diagnostics. He didn't need to be told what to do, he knew the plant systems like the back of his hand. But something felt off this time, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The usual methods weren't working. The circuits wouldn't behave as they should. They sparked and hummed with a strange energy. The current seemed to resist him. It was as though it was alive, twisting and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. As he reached out to adjust a faulty circuit, a sudden jolt shot through him, a shock so powerful it sent him flying backward across the room. The lights flickered as everything went dark for a split second. Zhou's body convulsed, and for a moment, it felt like the very air around him had thickened with static. His heart raced, and his vision blurred. But in the next instant, everything settled. He opened his eyes and found himself lying on the floor, surrounded by concerned faces. Luo Yifan was kneeling beside him, shaking him gently. "Zhou? Are you all right?" Zhou sat up, his mind still racing, his hands trembling. He could feel something different now. A strange pulse, almost like a heartbeat, running through his veins. But it wasn't his heart, it was the electricity, flowing through him in a way he couldn't explain. He had always been aware of the energy around him, but now, it was as though he had become a part of it. I'm fine," Zhou stammered, though his voice sounded distant, almost as though it wasn't his own. He stood up, and as he did, his hand brushed against a nearby console. There was a sudden spark, and the monitors around him flickered to life, showing a perfectly stable power grid. Luo Yifan looked at him in confusion. What just happened? Zhou stared at the screens, his mind reeling. He couldn't explain what had just occurred. He didn't know how, but he had somehow manipulated the flow of energy. He hadn't touched anything, at least, nothing he remembered. Before he could process it further, the emergency alarms went off. The main power grid had restabilized, but the plant was still in danger of a second surge. Zhou looked around and saw the panic in everyone's eyes. Get out of here! Zhou shouted, his voice firm now. His instincts kicked in. The room was unsafe. Everyone had to evacuate. As people began scrambling toward the exits, Zhou took a deep breath and extended his hand toward the control panel once more. This time, instead of just stabilizing the grid, he felt something surge through him, a wave of energy so intense it was almost like he could feel the very electrical currents flowing through his body. It was no longer about controlling machines or fixing wires, this was something deeper. He closed his eyes, focusing, and with a single thought, directed the electrical surge away from the facility, dissipating it before it could cause further damage. When he opened his eyes again, everything was silent. The grid had stabilized. The storm had passed. Zhou stood there for a moment, taking in the reality of what had just happened. He could still feel the strange hum inside him, like the electricity was part of him now. It wasn't just in the machines anymore, it was inside his very cells. He could control it. He could manipulate it. But why? How? And what did this mean for him, and the world? He was snapped from his thoughts by Luo Yifan's voice. Zhou, that was incredible. What just happened? You saved the entire plant. The power, it's under your control now. Zhou looked at him, still trying to come to grips with what had just occurred. I don't know. But I think I need to find out. Luo Yifan seemed to notice the uncertainty in his voice. Zhou, listen. The government is going to need you. You have something no one else has. We can use you to stabilize the nation's grid, maybe even save the world from the energy crisis we're facing. Zhou paused. There was something in Luo Yifan's tone, something urgent, almost desperate. Zhou had worked with government officials before, and he knew the weight of their requests. But this was different. This wasn't just about power lines and transformers. This was something far bigger. I don't know, Zhou said finally. I don't know what I'm dealing with here. Zhou Tao stood there, his mind racing. The room was still, save for the low hum of the backup generators that now ran smoothly. His heart was still thudding in his chest, but the physical shock had passed. It wasn't just the jolt of electricity that had shaken him, it was the realization of what had happened. He could control electricity. Not just as an engineer manipulating circuits, but something more primal. He had felt the current in his own body, felt it flow as if it was part of him. He turned toward Luo Yifan, whose face had gone from confusion to awe. It was clear that the senior official was stunned, perhaps even scared, but Zhou couldn't deal with that now. He needed answers. What did you see? Zhou asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. Luo shook his head slowly, eyes still wide. You didn't touch anything. The grid fixed itself. It was like you made it happen. You didn't even move your hands. It's like you. He stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. Zhou took a breath, running his hand through his hair. I didn't do anything. I didn't mean to. It just happened. Luo, clearly not satisfied with that answer, stepped forward. Zhou, this isn't just a freak accident. What you did, it was like you tapped into something we can't even begin to understand. The world is collapsing. We're facing a global energy crisis. The power outages are getting worse. People are rioting, nations are starting to lose control. And then you do that. His gaze shifted to the now stable screens, which flickered with data that made no sense to anyone but an engineer. You might just be the answer we've been looking for. Zhou took a moment to process, his fingers still tingling from the brief surge of power. The room had gone from chaos to calm in an instant, but his mind was anything but settled. Could it be? Could the answer to the world's energy crisis really lie in him? The thought both terrified and intrigued him. This wasn't what he signed up for. He was just an engineer, someone who liked to solve problems. Now, it seemed like the problem had become his own to solve. But how could he? He didn't even know the full extent of what had just happened. I don't know what I can do, Zhou replied, his voice quiet. This isn't something I planned for. He stopped himself, realizing that the more he tried to explain, the less it made sense. Luo Yifan pressed on. The government needs you. The country needs you. The world needs you. His tone was almost pleading, and Zhou could see the weight of responsibility in his eyes. We're on the brink of an all-out collapse, Zhou. If we don't find a way to stabilize the global energy grid soon, we might be looking at more than just blackouts. Wars are being fought over resources, and this could get a lot worse. You have a power we can't explain, and we need to harness it. We need to understand it. Zhou shook his head slowly, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't let himself be used like that. The idea of wielding that kind of power, of being the key to something so monumental, it felt too dangerous. Too much responsibility. I didn't ask for this, Zhou said finally, his voice tinged with frustration. I didn't choose this. And I don't know if I want to be the one to fix it. Luo didn't seem to take offense. Instead, he looked at Zhou with a hint of understanding. I get it. I do. But what you don't realize is that you might not have a choice. This is bigger than you. Bigger than me. Bigger than any one country or corporation. The world is changing, Zhou, and we need someone who can guide us through it. You could be the one to save us. Zhou glanced down at his hand, still tingling with residual energy. He could feel it, something inside him that was different now. As if the very molecules in his body had shifted, reprogrammed by the surge of power he had absorbed. It wasn't just about electricity anymore. It was something far more profound, something that went beyond technology, beyond circuits and wires. It felt like he could reach out and touch the very essence of energy itself. He didn't answer Luo immediately. Instead, he stepped over to the console, eyes fixed on the fluctuating data on the screen. It was as if the grid was now an extension of himself. He could almost sense its ebb and flow, the pulse of the system as it hummed beneath his fingertips. I need to understand what happened, Zhou said quietly. I need to figure out what I can actually do with this. Luo didn't push him. Instead, he nodded. Take the time you need. But know that we're watching. This isn't something we can let slip away. Zhou didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew the truth. Whatever was happening to him was going to change everything. Whether he liked it or not, for the next few days, Zhou kept to himself. He knew there was little he could do to hide what had happened. News of the power plant stabilization spread quickly, and rumors began to circulate. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. Luo's words had echoed in his mind over and over again. The world needs you. What did that even mean? And why had he been chosen for this? There were so many questions, and no answers in sight. It wasn't until the evening of the third day that things began to take a turn. Zhou had been in his apartment, sitting in front of a stack of schematics, when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but something in his gut told him it wasn't a coincidence. Hello? He answered, his voice hoarse. Zhou Tao, came a voice on the other end. It was smooth, calm, but there was an edge to it. We need to talk. Zhou's instincts flared. Who is this? The voice didn't hesitate. My name is Victor Ward. I'm with Volt Corp. I believe you're aware of the global energy situation. We're in a crisis, and we need someone like you to help us. There was a pause, a shift in the tone. You're not the only one with unique abilities, Zhou. We've been following you. Watching. We think you're the key to solving this. Zhou's stomach dropped. He hadn't expected this. Of course, a corporation like VoltCorp would be watching. They controlled most of the energy markets around the world. They had a vested interest in seeing Zhou's abilities put to good use, at least, their definition of good use. I don't know what you're talking about, Zhou said, trying to keep his voice steady. Victor chuckled softly. Let's not play games, Zhou. We know what you can do. And I believe we can offer you something in return for your cooperation. Control. Power. You could shape the future of energy, Zhou. You could rewrite the rules. All you have to do is join us. Zhou's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. VoltCorp was offering him something he couldn't ignore. They were powerful, influential. They had the resources to help him explore his abilities, to push them to their limits. But there was something unsettling about the offer. There was always a price with people like them. I'm not interested, Zhou said firmly. He couldn't let himself be bought. Not like this. Victor's tone shifted. That's unfortunate, he said, his voice darkening. Because you don't really have a choice. We'll be in touch. Before Zhou could respond, the line went dead. Zhou stood in the doorway, staring at the man before him. He was tall, his features sharp but unremarkable, someone who could blend into a crowd easily. His black suit was understated, but there was something in his eyes that made Zhou pause. There was a calmness there, an intensity that suggested this man was used to handling things that others might shy away from. The currents, Zhou repeated, his voice thick with skepticism. Who are you? The man didn't smile, but there was a quiet certainty in the way he held himself. You've been noticed, Zhou Tao. Your abilities are rare. And in a time like this, rare things attract attention, both good and bad. Zhou's stomach tightened. What do you want with me? I'm here to offer you a choice, the man said, his voice smooth and controlled. But first, I need you to listen. The world is teetering on the brink. Energy monopolies, government control, corporations, the way things are going, there will be no future for ordinary people. You know this. The global crisis is only a symptom of a much deeper problem. A system built on greed and dependency. And that's where you come in. Zhou felt a chill run down his spine. You're saying you want me to help you? Change the system? The man nodded slowly. Exactly. You have the power to reshape the way the world consumes energy, to break free from the stranglehold that companies like VoltCorp have over every facet of our lives. But you can't do it alone. We are a network of scientists, engineers, and visionaries, people who have spent their entire careers working in the shadows, trying to find a way to bring about a true revolution in energy. Zhou's mind raced. Everything this man was saying resonated with him. He had seen the corruption, the power struggles. He had known for years that the energy system was flawed, rigged in favor of the rich and powerful. But this was different. The very idea of it felt impossible, even reckless. And you think I'm the one to make this happen? Zhou asked, his voice low, tinged with doubt. The man smiled, though it wasn't the kind of smile that offered comfort. You don't realize how unique your abilities are, Zhou. You're not just an engineer anymore. You are the key to unlocking a new world order, where power is shared, where the flow of energy is no longer controlled by the few, but by the many. Zhou stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching out to steady himself against the doorframe. He couldn't process all of this at once. He had only just begun to understand the extent of his abilities, and now here was this stranger offering him a chance to change the world. Or destroy it. What's the catch? Zhou asked, Suspicion creeping into his voice, the man's gaze sharpened. No catch. Just a choice. We don't want to control you, Zhou. We want to work with you. Use your power to create something real. We can help you refine your abilities, push them further. We've got the resources, the technology. Together, we can disrupt the system. But you have to decide. Do you want to be a pawn for a government or a corporation? Or do you want to be free, to use your power to change everything? Zhou didn't respond immediately. The weight of the decision was crushing. He could feel the hum of the electricity inside him, as if it were calling to him, urging him to make a choice. He had never wanted to be a hero. He had never craved power. But what if this was bigger than himself? What if this was his chance to do something that mattered? You're asking me to trust you, Zhou said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. But I don't even know who you are. What if you're just like them? The man didn't flinch. I understand your hesitation. But the difference is, we don't want to own you. We don't want to make you into a tool. We want to change the way energy is distributed. We want to change the world, Zhou. You have the power to make that happen. Zhou closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear his mind. The electricity was still buzzing within him, filling his veins with heat. He had never felt so connected to something greater than himself. But that didn't mean he should let it control him. How do I know you're not lying? Zhou asked, still unsure. The man reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small, thin device. He placed it in Zhou's hand. This is a prototype, he said. It will help you understand the true scope of your abilities. You won't be able to ignore the truth once you see it. Zhou stared at the device. It was sleek and unassuming, but something about it felt important. He felt an odd pull to it, an urgency to understand more. He didn't know why he trusted this man, but something in him told him that this was the right path. I'll think about it, Zhou said, his voice hardening with resolve. But if this is some kind of trap, I won't hesitate to walk away. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. That's all we ask. But know this, Zhou, time is running out. The world is changing, and you are at the center of it. The choice is yours. Without waiting for a response, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the corridor of the building. Zhou stood in the doorway, still holding the device. The weight of it felt heavier now that he had made the decision to at least consider it. As he closed the door behind him, Zhou's mind raced. What had he just agreed to? He had no idea if he could trust the currents, but one thing was clear: his life, his future, and the future of the world had just taken a turn he could never have anticipated. The next few days passed in a blur. Zhou couldn't get the man's words out of his head. Every time he tried to focus on something else, work, the ongoing crisis, the fractured state of the world, his mind kept coming back to the offer. It was tempting, too tempting. The chance to use his powers to change the way the world worked, to fix a broken system. It was a dream he had never allowed himself to entertain. Until now, and then, one morning, as he sat at his desk, trying to focus on the schematic in front of him, his phone rang again. It was a number he didn't recognize, but this time, he didn't hesitate. He answered immediately. Zhou Tao, came the voice on the other end. It was Victor Ward, the representative from Volt Corp. We need to talk. Zhou felt a knot form in his stomach. He had expected this call. But that didn't make it any less uncomfortable. Zhou, Victor continued, we've been keeping track of your progress. We know what you can do now. And we think it's time we had a conversation about the future. About your future. Zhou's grip tightened on the phone. I'm not interested in what you're offering, he said, his voice cold. Victor's laugh on the other end was low, almost predatory. That's not what I'm offering, Zhou. We don't just want to use you. We want you to be a part of something bigger. We want you to shape the future with us. Zhou's heart raced. The words from the currents echoed in his mind. Who are you really? I've already had a conversation, Zhou said, his voice firm. And I've made my decision. There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Zhou wondered if he had just sealed his fate. But then Victor's voice came through again, more sinister this time. Don't make a mistake you'll regret, Zhou. The world is changing, whether you want to be part of it or not. And with that, the line went dead. Zhou sat there, the weight of his choices settling in like a storm cloud ready to break. He could feel the electricity surging in his veins again, stronger than before, as though it were calling him to action. It was time. The choice had been made. Zhou sat in his apartment, the phone still pressed to his ear as the dial tone echoed in his ear. The conversation with Victor Ward had ended abruptly, but the weight of his words hung in the air, thick with the promise of danger and power. Zhou's mind churned with the implications. He had been offered power before, by VoltCorp, by the government, even by the mysterious currents, but now it felt as though the stakes had been raised to an entirely new level. His abilities, his potential, had attracted attention from both sides. The more he tried to distance himself from their plans, the more they seemed to pull him in. He threw the phone onto the couch, pacing the room. The world was on the brink of collapse, and everyone wanted a piece of him, wanted to use him as a tool to achieve their own ends. VoltCorp, with its smooth promises of control, was no different from the government in Zhou's eyes. They were all the same, hungry for power, using the energy crisis as a means to their own selfish purposes. But the currents were different. At least, that's what they wanted him to believe. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to make sense of it all. Every choice seemed like a dangerous one. If he joined VoltCorp, he would be handing them control over something far more dangerous than any other resource, control over the very currents of life itself. If he sided with the currents, he would be thrust into a fight that might be too big to win, a battle against forces much more powerful than any rogue scientist or engineer could handle. And if he refused both, then what? Would he just go back to living the life he had before, knowing that the world around him was falling apart? The answer wasn't clear, and Zhou hated the uncertainty. It was in times like this, when the pressure mounted and everything seemed to be falling apart, that he would usually retreat to his work, find comfort in the hum of machinery, in the predictable flow of electricity. But this time, there was no escape. Zhou finally stopped pacing, standing in the center of his apartment. The air around him felt charged, as though his very presence was influencing the current in the room. He raised his hand, just slightly, and for a split second, he could feel the vibrations in the air, the energy that flowed through every wire, every circuit, every atom in the room. It was all connected. He thought back to the first time he had felt it, the first time he had manipulated the energy at the plant. That raw, almost primal power had surged through him, and for a brief moment, it had felt like he could do anything. And maybe, just maybe, he could, but could he control it? Could he control them? Could he control the consequences of his own power? His abilities felt like a force of nature, but nature wasn't always kind. It didn't care if you were ready for it or not. The phone rang again, breaking through his thoughts. This time, the number was familiar. Luo Yifan. Zhou hesitated, but only for a moment. He knew the government had been keeping tabs on him. If there was one thing they understood, it was the need for control. Zhou had no doubt that they were just waiting for the right moment to pull him into their fold. He answered the phone. Zhou, Luo's voice came through, calm but urgent. We need to meet. It's about the energy situation. Zhou paused. The last time they'd spoken, Luo had been insistent that he work with the government, to use his abilities for the greater good. But now, after everything that had happened, Zhou wasn't sure where his loyalty lay. The government had its own agenda, and so did the corporations. Everyone was playing a game, and Zhou wasn't sure he wanted to be part of it anymore. Luo, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this, Zhou said, his voice betraying his inner conflict. There's too much at stake. I'm not sure I can trust anyone anymore. I understand your hesitation, Luo responded, his tone softening. But Zhou, the world is crumbling. You've seen it. You know what's happening. The energy crisis is just the beginning. You're the only one who can do something about it. And time is running out. Zhou leaned against the window, looking out at the city below. It felt like everything was moving in slow motion, but in his mind, time was accelerating. The pressure was suffocating. I don't have the answers, Zhou replied. I don't even know what I'm dealing with. This power inside me, it's not something I can control. It's not something I can just point at a problem and fix. There was a brief silence on the other end, and when Luo spoke again, his voice was filled with resolve. That's why you need us, Zhou. You don't have to control everything. Let us help you understand it. Together, we can harness this power, turn it into something that can save the world. Zhou's grip tightened on the phone. He didn't want to be used by anyone, but he couldn't ignore the desperation in Luo's voice. The truth was, Zhou wasn't sure he could save the world alone. But if he didn't act, who would? Where do you want to meet? Zhou asked, finally giving in. There was a brief pause, and then Luo's voice came through with a sense of urgency. The government's research facility on the outskirts of the city. We'll be waiting for you. Zhou ended the call and stared out the window, his reflection staring back at him. He had made the decision. There was no going back now. Hours later, Zhou found himself driving through the outskirts of the city, the roads growing quieter as he got closer to the government facility. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but his mind kept returning to the same question: what could he really accomplish by working with them? Could he trust Luo? Could he trust anyone? The facility was isolated, surrounded by tall fences and security gates. It was the kind of place where secrets were kept, where the government hid its most valuable resources and research. As Zhou approached the entrance, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. But then again, he had already walked into one. He just hadn't realized it yet. That he parked his car and made his way inside, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The facility was cold, sterile, like a hospital. The air felt heavy with anticipation as Zhou made his way down a corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. When he reached the lab, Luo Yifan was waiting for him. He was alone. Zhou, Luo said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. I'm glad you came. Zhou didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, taking in the sterile surroundings, the rows of computers, the machines humming quietly in the background. This was where they studied energy, where they tried to manipulate it, control it. What is this place? Zhou asked, his voice low. This is where we do our most important work, Luo replied. We've been researching alternative energy sources for years, trying to find a way to stabilize the global grid. But we've been fighting an uphill battle. That's where you come in, Zhou. You have the key to unlocking a new world of energy. You've already demonstrated it. And with your help, we can make it a reality. Zhou shook his head. I don't know if I can. I don't even know how it works. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You don't need to understand it all, Zhou, Luo said, stepping closer. We'll help you. We'll guide you. Together, we can change everything. You've already taken the first step by being here. Zhou's heart raced as he looked at Luo. The man was sincere, but there was something more beneath the surface. Zhou could sense it. The government wasn't just interested in fixing the energy crisis. They had their own plans, plans that would require more than just Zhou's abilities. I need more time to think, Zhou said, his voice shaky. Luo's expression hardened. Time is something we don't have. You know that. The world is breaking, Zhou. And you're the only one who can stop it. Zhou took a step back. I'm not your weapon, Luo. I'm not anyone's weapon. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of Zhou's words hanging in the air. And then, Without another word, Zhou turned and walked out of the room, his mind racing, his future uncertain. Zhou walked briskly through the sterile hallways, his footsteps echoing with each step. He barely noticed the security guards stationed at regular intervals, nor the cold, clinical environment that surrounded him. All that filled his mind was the feeling of being trapped, pulled in different directions by forces he couldn't fully comprehend. The hum of the government facility, the pressure to choose between two competing factions, and the raw electricity that surged inside him, he could feel it all, pushing him toward decisions he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The weight of Luo Yifan's words still lingered in his mind. Time is something we don't have. Zhou had known that for a long time. The world was on the brink. But did he really want to be the one to fix it? Could he really control the power that now coursed through him? He had no clear answers, only the sense that the world was moving faster than he could keep up with, that his power was both a gift and a curse. As he reached the exit, Zhou felt a tightness in his chest. He knew he needed space, time to think, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't just the government's eyes on him, it was Voltcorp, it was the currents, it was everyone. His every move was being tracked. The question wasn't whether he was important, but how he would be used. And who would be the one to use him? He stepped into the parking lot and paused, staring at his car. He had half a mind to drive far away, to leave everything behind and disappear into the mountains or the coast. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it wasn't an option. There was nowhere left to hide. Not anymore. As he started the car and pulled out of the lot, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated, glancing at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but there was something about the timing that made him press the answer button. Zhou Tao, a voice crackled through the phone. You've made your choice, haven't you? Zhou's heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't one he recognized, but it was familiar enough to make him uneasy. I don't know what you mean, Zhou replied, trying to keep his voice steady as he navigated the city streets. The voice on the other end chuckled softly. You're not a fool, Zhou. We both know what's happening. The world is changing, and your abilities are the key. The currents may have their ideals, but they lack the resources to make real change. Voltcorp, on the other hand, they can give you the power you need to truly reshape things. They can give you everything. Zhou's grip tightened on the steering wheel. I've already turned you down, he said firmly. The voice didn't flinch. You may think that now, but let me ask you this. What happens when you realize the government is using you as a pawn, just like the rest of them? They'll take everything you have and leave you with nothing but the scraps. You don't want to end up like them. Zhou's stomach twisted. He'd felt that same feeling in Luo's eyes earlier, the sense that he was just another cog in the machine. But the alternative? He didn't want to be controlled by anyone. Not Voltcorp, not the government, not anyone. I'm not interested, Zhou repeated, but even as he said it, he felt the doubt creeping in. The voice on the other end grew colder. I think you will be, Zhou. You'll see. And when the time comes, we'll be waiting for you. The call ended abruptly. Zhou let the phone fall into his lap as he kept driving, his mind whirling. That had to be Voltcorp. He knew they wouldn't just let him go. Their grip was like iron, and they wouldn't rest until they had him where they wanted him. But that didn't mean he had to give in. Yet, even as the thought formed in his mind, another part of him wondered if he was already too far gone. What if he couldn't fight them off? What if they had already won? His phone buzzed again, this time with a message. He glanced at the screen. It was a simple text, you don't have to face this alone. The currents. Zhou gritted his teeth and tossed the phone aside. No matter what he did, there was no escaping the gravity of the situation. He was caught between two worlds, two forces, each trying to pull him in different directions. And in the middle of it all was his power, the very thing that had set this entire chain of events into motion. He parked the car and got out, walking toward his apartment building. It felt like a strange kind of homecoming, even though it was far from safe. His place, his refuge, was no longer a sanctuary. It was just another place where the world could find him. He entered the building and headed upstairs, passing through the empty hallway to his door. As he reached for the handle, he noticed something that made his blood run cold, a small piece of paper taped to the door. His name was scrawled across it in black ink. Joe slowly reached out and pulled the paper off, his fingers trembling. As he unfolded it, he read the message inside. "We know what you can do. Join us or face the consequences. Volt Corp." The words seemed to burn into the page, their finality echoing in his head. It wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. They had been watching him. They were waiting for him to make a decision, and now they had made theirs. Joe slammed the door behind him as he entered the apartment, feeling the weight of it all press down on him. He couldn't run anymore. He was caught in the middle of a storm he didn't fully understand, a storm of power and control, and the only way out was to play the game. He didn't know which side to trust, but he did know one thing: he couldn't keep going like this. He had to make a choice. Joe walked to the window and looked out at the city, the lights flickering in the distance. The weight of the decision was suffocating. And yet, it felt like it was no longer just about him. It was about the world. His power, the thing he had been so terrified of, was the only thing that could change anything now, but was he willing to give it all up for the chance to change the world? Could he handle the consequences of his actions? He didn't know the answer yet. But he did know that the world wouldn't wait for him to decide.